and the Marine barracks at the airport. And in the attack on the Marine barracks, 241 U.S. Marines were killed. And they were killed by a truck bomb that the Israelis, the Mossad, knew all about. The Mossad knew the type of the truck, where it was being built, what kind of bomb it had, the license plates, everything. But they didn't tell that to the American military. So the American military paid the price in blood. The head of Israeli intelligence said to the other Mossad people, he said, the Americans are a big country. They can take care of themselves. So what it indicates, though, is that the Mossad knew all about the truck bomb. Now, how did the Mossad know all about the truck bomb if they weren't involved in making the truck bomb? And those details can be gleaned from the book by the former Mossad operative agent. His name is Victor Ostrovsky. He's a Canadian. He was a Mossad agent. And he, after his term over there with the Mossad and everything, he came back to Canada and the United States. And I think he lives in Arizona now. And he wrote some books called By Way of Deception and Beyond Deception. And he also wrote a fictional book called The Lion of Judah. And he writes about exactly how the Mossad does these things. And this information is all coming from him. Well, when the Israelis created this doctrine of the war on terror, they needed, obviously, an enemy. You have to have an enemy. So they had to create an enemy, because the enemy wasn't there. So they had to create one. And when the Red Army, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, that gave the Americans and the Israelis the opportunity to create this anti-Western force. We began arming, Ronald Reagan and the CIA began arming the Mujahideen, here seen in the Oval Office. And in this operation, which really began with a lot of money in 1983, the CIA was arming the Afghans to fight the Red Army. And the main allies in this operation were Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. And the guy that ran it from the Congress was this man, Charlie Wilson from Texas. He was very, very pro-Israel. And when he got elected to Congress in 1973, he went to Washington, and he came under the wing of the Mossad station chief in Washington, a man named Zvi Rafia. And what happened, if you read the book about Charlie Wilson's war, you'll read that the lion's share of the money from the CIA in Saudi Arabia was given to this group led by this man Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, seen in the lower picture there, with the black beard. And what's peculiar about this is that the CIA and the Mossad were arming the most anti-Western group out there. There were other groups they could have given money to Abdul Haq, who was a very effective Pashtun fighter. Very effective. And yet they didn't give money to Abdul Haq, rather they gave money to this guy's operation, which never had any success in the battlefield, which was known for basically stirring up the other groups, the other Mujahideen groups, and which was the most anti-Western. Why would the Americans and the Israelis be funding and arming the most anti-Western group out there? It doesn't make any sense, unless you consider that what they were really doing is they were creating the enemy for the war on terror, the next war. They were creating tomorrow's enemy. This is how it worked. The Mossad connection, Charlie Wilson was the guy that wanted to defeat the Red Army, he wanted to arm these guys, and he was being led by this Israeli head of the Mossad, the man in the lower picture, Zvi Rafia, who was in fact the Mossad station chief in Washington. And what Rafia did is that he used Charlie Wilson's office, congressional office, as if it were his own. This is a quote from the book, Charlie Wilson's War. It says on the lower left, Zvi Rafia always acted as if he owned Wilson's office. One of the staffers kept a list of people he needed to lobby. He would use the phones, give projects to the staff, and call on Charlie to intervene whenever he needed him. So this is a case where the Mossad chief was basically using a congressman and his office to accomplish Israeli policy in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And what they did is that the Israelis trained these Afghan fighters. And the Hekmatyar group included a group of Arabs, which are called the Afghan Arabs. These are Arabs who were sent or went to Pakistan in order to fight with the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen, of course, were Afghan people, not Arabs. The Arabs were people come from Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries to fight with them in the jihad, right? And what's interesting is that the people who were training this group was Israeli military intelligence. And at the time, 1983, 84, and 85, the man who headed Israeli military intelligence was Ehud Barak, the man who blamed Osama bin Laden. So his men are the ones who trained Osama bin Laden in the beginning. Okay, now in 1983, Ehud Barak, this is Ehud Barak as military intelligence chief. He's shaking hands with Ariel Sharon when Ariel Sharon was found guilty of personal responsibility in the massacre of Sabra and Shatila. He had to leave office, he had to give up his defense portfolio, and the Kahan Commission in Israel said that because he was personally responsible for the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, that he should never hold office in Israel again. How many years later? Less than 20 years later, he was elected prime minister of the country. Ariel Sharon became prime minister a few weeks after George Bush finally became president of this country in the winter of 2001. Here is the Mossad's man who trained Osama bin Laden. His name is Ali Mohammed, and he was the first trainer of Al-Qaeda. He's the one who trained Osama bin Laden and al-Zawahiri. He's the one who set up the bombing of the U.S. embassies in Africa. And he was involved in all the Al-Qaeda terrorist activities in the 1980s, like the USS Cole and the African bombings. And what happened is that the United States then held him in a trial, put him in a trial for the bombing of the embassies in Africa, and he was found guilty. And then he was put away in American state penitentiary, federal penitentiary for life or something like that. And then he just disappeared. He's completely disappeared. He disappeared from the American judicial system. He disappeared from the federal penitentiary system like thin air, gone. And what's interesting about this fella is that he was a Hebrew-speaking double agent. Supposedly Egyptian, yet he spoke fluent Hebrew. So he's obviously some sort of triple agent working for the Israelis as well. And you have to understand that when the Israeli military intelligence started training the Al-Qaeda people in Pakistan, the people who became Al-Qaeda, they had to have Arabic-speaking trainers. And that's not a problem for Israel because there's many, many Israelis who were born in places like Morocco or Iraq who speak the language and can appear to be Iraqi or Moroccan or Egyptian very well, but are in fact Israelis. And so Ali Mohammed and the Israelis trained these characters who became Al-Qaeda. First, they were members of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group, and then when they lost Saudi support, after they supported Saddam Hussein in 1991, and they lost Pakistani support in 1994, all of that group that the Israelis had trained merged into Al-Qaeda and Taliban. And of course, Al-Qaeda then morphed into ISIS, what we're fighting today. This is how the idea of catastrophic terrorism was pushed on the American intelligentsia. Through a magazine like this, it's a Council of Foreign Relations magazine called Foreign Affairs. And in 1998, Philip Zelikow, the man who wrote the 9/11 Commission report, headed a study group called the Catastrophic Terrorism Study Group with Ashton Carter and John Deutsch. Ashton Carter is, of course, today our Secretary of Defense. And in this document that they had published, this is a report of their findings of their study group, they imagined the transforming event. And they talk about that transforming act of catastrophic terrorism that will change America. And I think most of you will agree that America has been gravely changed, profoundly altered by the events of 9/11. And the men that wrote that catastrophic terrorism report, as I said, were Ashton Carter and John Deutsch with Philip Zelikow. Ashton Carter's top left, man in the middle with the blue sweaters, Ashton Carter, former head of the CIA. Now, the important thing about Ashton Carter to understand, if you look at his resume, you will see that his entire life has been spent as an employee of the Rothschild family, which is to say that our defense minister today is basically a Rothschild agent. Now, another group that had a big role in transforming American military policy was this group called Project for the New American Century. And the PNAC people are these people at the bottom here. The Kagan family, Donald Kagan, a Lithuanian-born Jewish fella, Robert Kagan and Fred, and Robert's wife is Victoria Nuland. If any of you recall what happened in Ukraine a couple years ago, the putsch, the coup d'etat that happened in Kiev, that was all the doings of Victoria Nuland. She's Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasia, and she's the person who oversaw the coup d'etat, and she installed the Prime Minister, Yatsenyuk, in Ukraine that caused almost a war with Russia because Yatsenyuk was strongly anti-Russian, but about 25% of the population of Ukraine is Russian. So that didn't go too well. But these people, this Pinak Kagan family, they drafted a document 1 year before 9/11 in which they called for the United States to occupy Iraq and build permanent bases there, whether Saddam Hussein was on the throne or not. They said that didn't matter. We should do that as policy in the Middle East. And they said the process of transformation, this military transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. And this, of course, was the new Pearl Harbor. 9/11 was the terror atrocity that changed America, it changed American foreign policy, and it brought us the war on terror. But as I've tried to make clear now, the war on terror was already like a bonfire that was all built, ready to light, all gassed up, and the enemy was painted on the back wall. They just needed to light it. And this is the spark that lit it. And as I said, Ehud Barak said, now it's time, finally America, now it's time to launch an operational, concrete war against terror. He said that before either building fell, just to give you an indication of how early they did it. And this is something called the primacy effect. When something like this happens, the culprits want to get their narrative out there first, before you have time to even scratch your head and think, who might have done this? Before you even get to that point of thinking, they're telling you who did it. And you'll see it with every terrorism attack, every false flag terrorism attack that happens these days, you'll see they do exactly the same thing. And reading from the Zionist script on 9/11, President Bush said, our way of life and our very freedom was under attack. He said, America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. Obviously, the terrorists didn't know about places like Switzerland, where there's plenty of freedom and opportunity. And a few days later, on September 20th, 2001, it was 9 days after 9/11, he declared war on terror, saying in Congress, every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. He basically bifurcated the world into terrorists and U.S. allies. That scared a lot of countries. What I want to point out in this slide, you see the Speaker of the House behind him, who's shaking his hand, clapping his hands. That man is Denny Hestert, and if you're familiar, he's been proven now to be a pedophile who spent millions of dollars trying to keep the young men quiet back in Illinois who he had molested. And I would say that there are probably more men like him in Congress than you understand, than you think. Now, what's the latest phase in this war on terror? These guys, Islamic State. Who are these guys? That's the question. We know that something like 22,000 of these men are all paid mercenaries, which is why they wear the black ski masks, because they have red hair or black skin or white skin, or they don't look like Syrians or Iraqis, because they're not. Many of them, I would presume, are actually Israelis. And these are the people who are running this kind of theatrical band. And it seems like, although the United States overthrew the government of Iraq and the military of Iraq in a few weeks, they seem to be at a loss to defeat this little army of guys in Toyota trucks. You know, we've been bombing these guys for over a year, and it doesn't seem to slow them down at all. What's interesting is that everything we know about this group, ISIS, comes to us from an Israeli website called SITE, Intelligence Group, which is based in Bethesda, Maryland. So that the videos, here you can see one of the videos comes from SITE. That's the logo of SITE up there in the upper corner. So what this woman, the woman at the top, her name is Rita Katz. She's an Israeli Mossad agent from Iraq. She runs this little website, and her group has subscribers, and then she sends to her subscribers the video feed and the news about ISIS. So when ISIS releases a video, they release it to her, and then she releases it to BBC and CBS and NBC. And when the